Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. Where does R&D belong in your organization? We apologize for the brief delay. We thank you for joining us, though. Before we get started, I'd like to take us through a few housekeeping items to help you better interact with the panelists throughout the session today, as well as to qualify for CPE, as I know that's important to many of you. The slides that we'll be going through today, as well as two other pieces of information that we'll make reference to, are available by download through the webinar console. There's a resource widget that you'll find at the bottom of the console. You can click on that, find the materials, and download them from there. We will also allow time to answer questions that you have at the end of the session. You can ask your questions at any point throughout the session by clicking on the Q&A widget, also at the bottom of the console. To receive CPE for today, what you need to do is, first of all, be logged in individually to today's webinar so we can identify you personally. You have to also accrue at least 50 minutes of material time. That's our responsibility. And no, the 2-minute delay doesn't count for your 50 minutes, but we'll get you to 50 minutes. Your responsibility will be to answer at least 3 of the 4 polling questions throughout the session. Once you do that, at the end of the session, you will find your CPE certificate available also on your webinar console. There will be a CPE widget, and you guessed it, it's at the bottom of the console like everything else. So feel free to find your certificate there. And now the presenters. My name's Chris Jones. I'll be your moderator today. I'm the National Services Industry Leader for Plant Moran. I had the privilege of being part of the Innovation Survey team this year for Plant Moran, and it was neat to see the results come in, to read the actual survey respondent comments, and to really take part in interpreting it and bringing it to you. Being involved in the services and technology industry, I'm going to bring a little bit of balance to our conversation from the 2 manufacturing experts I have here, and help you understand that innovation belongs in non-manufacturers as well as manufacturers. But now for our experts. To my left here is Ken Boyer. So Ken is an operations management expert at the Fisher School of Business at The Ohio State University. He and his colleagues recently authored a research paper, How do growing middle market firms exploit their innovations, the challenges of managing R&D and manufacturing. Ken, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. Actually, I do work on both services and manufacturing, so I can comment on both, and as we go down, Jeff will be all manufacturing. I did want to give a little mention to my colleagues who participated in the study. Arvind Chandrasekaran, a very challenging name, but he is an expert in innovation studies, ambidextrous organizations that we'll be talking about later. And John Gray is an expert in outsourcing both manufacturing and service processes. But it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Great. And to Ken's left is Jeff Mangle. So Jeff is Plant Moran's national practice leader for plastics as well as food processing and packaging industries. He has more than 30 years of experience in operational strategic planning. Jeff speaks on innovative practices, industry benchmarking data, and best practices. And Jeff co-authored the 2012 Plant Moran Innovation Survey. So Jeff, welcome.
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to contributing to the discussion today.
So let's get us warmed up a little bit here with our first polling question. Again, to receive CPE, we need to have you answer this to identify yourself. My firm has sales from new products and services introduced in the past 5 years of, for your company, do 0 to 10%, 11 to 20%, 20 to 30%, or more than 30% of your sales that you currently have come from new or improved products within the last 5 years.
And Chris, while people are filling that out, a couple examples of very successful companies nowadays are Apple, which has typically 60% of its revenues coming from products introduced within the last 3 years. Kellogg's, a very manufacturing-based business, cereal and snack foods in a relatively slow-growing industry, still has 15% of its revenues coming from products introduced within the last 5 years. So there are companies on both extremes of the spectrum.
Yeah, when you think about cereal, you don't think innovation, but sure enough, it is.
Yes, can innovate anything.
Okay, so let's take a look at the results here. So 0 to 10%, but quite a bit in that above 10% as well, which probably isn't surprising given what we found in the innovation survey is last few years, companies have really been asking the question, how do I get started in innovation? This year in the survey results, we really saw a shift to more companies asking higher level questions. like the one we're covering today, like where does innovation and R&D belong in my organization? Fewer are asking, how do I even start? Okay, are we ready to start?
Yes, we are.
We are ready to go.
All right, as we begin, I would like to give a thank you to the National Center for the Middle Market for their ongoing support of the Plant Moran Innovation Survey. The National Center's 2011 research is still a foundational research and one that we refer to often that talks about the importance of innovation within growing middle market companies. They talk about it being foundational for the growing middle market companies and really being a crucial part of it. Those companies that we called growth champions in that work exhibited sharper customer focus, broader geographic vision, stronger management culture, and excellent talent management. Plant Moran has been doing our innovation survey since that 2011 time as well, so we've continued to partner together with the center, and it's been a great partnership throughout that period of time. So thanks again to them. Now, the 2013 survey results, one of the many positives that came out of the results were that 94% of the business leaders within our respondent group indicated that innovation was essential for their continued growth of their organization. And not only that it was important, but again, 94% said innovation was essential. We also found that 74% included innovation in their business strategy. So let's think about that for a minute. 94% of business leaders said innovation was essential. 74% had innovation in their business strategy. Jeff, talk about the significance of that.
Innovation is one of these activities that must be led by the leaders. It has to be driven home. The leaders must prioritize it. They must highlight it in a regular basis, and they must budget for it. Otherwise, what we're going to have is accidental innovation that needs to figure out, the company needs to figure out where the next process or next innovation is going to come from. They don't have a process in place. So what we're looking for is what do companies have to do to create the process of innovation? And Ken, I'm certain you have seen some tensions in organizations you've assisted.
Absolutely. Almost every organization struggles between what we'll talk about later, exploring for new ideas and exploiting process innovations to get better at something. And really the classic example is Henry Ford and the Model T. Came up with the Model T in 1910 and came up with the moving assembly line in 1913. The Model T didn't change for 14 years after that because Henry Ford was so obsessed with improving the process for making the Model T. He cut the cost of the car by 75%, so he made a car affordable to the masses, but he didn't bring to market new innovations such as the automatic starter on cars. So you used to have to crank the car, and one of the interesting facts is back in the day, one of the common injuries was when the engine would backfire and the crank would come back at you and break your arm. Ford didn't realize the need to start innovating products until the mid-1920s when General Motors under Alfred Sloan started introducing new models every year, different colors of cars, and started taking market leadership away from Ford.
Yeah, it's interesting. You think about cars today, and that was the criticism of the U.S. automakers once upon a time, was the cars were just, they were the same year in, year out. And now you get to cars, the cadence of new cars and new technologies within cars is coming so rapidly.
Absolutely. The development cycle on new cars has gone from roughly 7 years, 20 years ago, to 3 years. And the cars are massively more complex with all the different technologies inside of the car.
Just incredible. Tell us about, you and I were talking earlier about 3M. Tell us about 3M.
3M is an example of the classic innovative company. They're known for coming up with new products, new services. One of the classic stories is the Post-it note, which one of their employees invented without really knowing how to use it. And other employees within 3M came up with new ways to put Post-it notes out there. And of course, you can't walk 20 feet in an office these days without some sort of Post-it note popping up. But they really struggled in the early 2000s. Jack Welch had taken General Electric to stratospheric heights by championing Six Sigma and lean processes. 3M decided to hire one of his disciples, James McNerney, was hired in 2000, and the stock went up 20% in one day. problem is, what happens when you take an innovative company and try to change the culture too much? McNerney axed 8,000 workers and implemented Lean Six Sigma practices. They got better at manufacturing, but over 5 years, 3M slipped from a third of its revenues coming from products released within the last 5 years to a quarter. And they started to lose their innovative culture, so that they decided to go a new direction and found a new CEO. A contrasting example is Medtronics. Medtronics is a major medical products manufacturer. They've always had separate R&D and manufacturing. They briefly considered using Six Sigma methods for R&D in the middle 2000s, but they decided that it might hamper creativity. It might put the wrong measurements and incentives on their innovation team, and they've continued to stay very innovative.
So Jeff, our earlier polling question talked about within the last 5 years. Ken just referenced within the last 5 years. Why are we talking about the last 5 years? Why is that significant?
Well, the rate of innovation is one that if we have innovation, we want to be able to develop the process and be ahead of our competition. If it's out there too long, our competition has every right to have to replicate and duplicate. There is another form of R&D, but we want to have the research and development create new innovation and create that competitive advantage.
And that differs by industry. So one of the terms used is clock speed. So computers, electronics tend to have a very dynamic, fast-moving environment where the product life cycle is fairly short. So there you might measure new products introduced in the last 2 to 3 years. Cereal, like I mentioned earlier with Kellogg's, or cars or heavy industrial goods tends to have a slower life cycle. But what you have to be measuring against is who are the competitors in your segment.
I would also like to add one other thought process, and that is, if you don't have that tension between innovating for new product and managing your existing product, the inertia of the existing product wins, and people will find themselves spending their days managing the urgent issues associated with the product that's at hand, and not the opportunity of product that's going to be in the future. So you need to have that, it's a healthy tension, have that tension in there that says, I need to prioritize. And again, that comes from the leadership, identifying what that priority needs to be.
Yeah, I know in my discussions with Ashish Nanda from Harvard and his group that works with professional service firms, there's a drift from what's cutting edge today is commodity tomorrow. And like you said, Jeff, if your attention's on what we already have, your margins are deteriorating on those products. You got to build the new ones for the higher margins and keep re-energizing things. So that takes us to our second polling question. So to the statement, my firm struggles with evaluating R&D and non-R&D personnel. Do you agree, neither agree or disagree, or disagree, and to what extent?
And while you're filling out that question, a couple things to think about. How do you manage and motivate innovation? Incentives are a key part of things. So the incentives that one of the things we're going to talk about for manufacturing or process improvement have to be different than for R&D. You have to consider whether you're giving individual incentives or group incentives, and there has to be a mechanism for rewarding successes, not necessarily financially. So for example, the first Macintosh developed at Apple was signed by everybody who worked on the product team, and every Macintosh printed had inside of it on the plastic casing all the names of the developers. That meant more than money ever could to those developers.
One of the things that we found in the prior studies that we've done is that the top innovators, our super innovators, rewarded and celebrated the successes of the innovation. And the rewards, as you mentioned, did not have to be financial.
Okay, let's take a look at our results here. So 58% of respondents would have agreed or somewhat agreed, and a much smaller portion somewhat disagreed, which is probably consistent with why people are logged on to our session today to begin with.
And why it's a consistent challenge. It's sort of two different mindsets, left brain, right brain. It's very hard to figure out how to manage those two balances.
Sure. Ken, take us into this next slide, if you will.
Okay, so the classic setting for large firms has been, for the most part, firms separate R&D and manufacturing. They use different people, processes, and metrics for R&D than for manufacturing. You have to reward people different ways. The high level, the decision making has to be integrated at the high level. And as a real quick story, Amazon is a hugely successful, basically the #1 internet retailer on the planet. They started early as a small firm working mostly on process innovation. And one of the famous stories is Jeff Bezos, when they were fulfilling book orders manually, they'd pick off the shelves and their employees complained that they had to bend down too much and their knees hurt. So he went out and bought volleyball knee pads for all the employees. Amazon early on was very process oriented on getting the books done, but they had to change, and they created a separate R&D structure when they brought out the Kindle in 2007 because it required a whole new set of skills to manufacture Kindle. They never manufactured anything, to deal with publishers and get rights to the books, to set up the electronic marketplace for selling books. The final thing on this slide that I want to point out is we call very successful firms that balance R&D and manufacturing. R&D can be called exploration, manufacturing can be called exploitation, getting better at what you do. We call these firms ambidextrous. Not all firms are great at both of these, but if you can be very good or great at both of these, you're going to outperform your competitors.
You know, one of the things that come to mind as you're talking about these two different areas, I was at a business breakfast earlier this summer where they had the one of the NASCAR teams there, as well as the heads of the racing teams from the OEMs. And it was interesting to me as they were talking about the how the racing teams, the NASCAR actual teams on the ground, they actually are an R&D arm for the OEMs, and transferring some of that technology that's developed and prototyped and tested on the racetracks actually goes into, they gave examples of technology that's in today's Stingray and Cadillacs that came from the racetracks. So I thought that was interesting, those two sides coming together because of common management.
And but looking at the smaller organization and how the smaller organization addresses R&D. So if we look at this slide here, Ken, perhaps you can talk in a couple of these bullets.
Absolutely. Most small organizations start off with a very passionate founder, somebody who's recognized a hole in the market, a product, a service they can provide. So one example is Yankee Candle in New England. The founder of that company started off making candles for his mother that started selling them at a local store. They had to learn to get better at the processes. They got better. Early on, the founder, the head of the company can know everybody in the company, but at a later point, it becomes hard to keep track of that. So another example to go back to Apple is Apple's always been very innovative under Steve Jobs, but early on in the 1980s, they brought on John Scully from Pepsi to make Apple a little bit more balanced, and he had major fights with Jobs, and Jobs ended up leaving. But at that point, Apple really needed to improve its processes, which is common for small firms.
And what we've seen in our studies that we had in the past, 2012 study, is a significant number of small companies really start out as accidental innovators. This is where the passionate owner takes an idea and brings it to life and creates a whole company to serve that idea. The question is going to be is what does he do next? What's the next item? What's the next idea that needs to be produced? So they get their ideas from customers, from vendors, really just being in the environment and being good listeners. But they have no formal system in place to replicate the process.
Yeah, so you look at an example that we've talked about before with Prince Corporation and the Prince family, and there's a family organization started out with a simple, somewhat accidental innovation. They put a mirror and a visor in their car and drove around with it like that, and that turned into an actual innovation. As the company grew, they put more processes in place, more management in place, and worked out from a accidental innovator to today they'd be seen as a superstar innovator, I believe.
They've developed a number of innovations that you'll see in your car visor. Whenever you pull that down, you see the lighted visor, you see the adjustments you could have to the visors and all sorts of other activities that are up in the upper headrest or headliner of a car.
Yeah. Another very good example is McDonald's. If you're not familiar with the history of McDonald's, I'm sure you're familiar with McDonald's because 10% of America eats there on a given day. But early on in their existence, they were one restaurant in California, but run by the McDonald's brothers. And they were doing very well. They went from car hop service to self-service walk-up. And what Ray Kroc did is he recognized the opportunity. He grew that small firm by essentially taking the McDonald's brothers concept and replicating it and putting a process in place for standardizing all of their restaurants and building out across the whole United States. But they were also successful as they went along. They realized they needed new products. And one of the ways they got the new products is from their owner-operators. So Chris would run McDonald's, Jeff would run another McDonald's. Jeff maybe is the guy who came up with the Egg McMuffin and found a way to give breakfast to the restaurant and increase their sales. Corporate then took that innovation, standardized it, and rolled it out to all the restaurants.
Yep, absolutely. So we've talked about the large companies, and they have their structure, their R&D, and their operations arm. We talk about the small companies, and they often tend to be more the accidental innovators. On the middle market companies, what we found through our studies is the middle market companies are right in the middle of innovation as well. They're doing many of the right things, but they don't have all the structure that they sometimes need. I'll give you an example. One of our respondents this year in the innovation survey was a little bit frustrated that they said, you know, we're doing the right things. We're sending more of our staff to conferences, events, conventions, and they're getting ideas and their juices are flowing and they come back so excited, and then they get bogged down with their work and none of those great ideas ever end up happening. So that's some of the tension that we're seeing with the middle market companies.
Absolutely. It's a challenge. Middle market firms don't have sufficient resources often to do both R&D and maintain operations. They need to find a way to dedicate some resources. Employees tend to be very cross-functional. Another example is Masco. Masco makes a lot of the things that are in your home. If you shop at Home Depot, Lowe's, your hardware store, they make Merillat cabinets, Brasscraft, Delta faucet. Masco's grown over the last 30 years by acquiring a series of relatively small or medium manufacturing firms, and by centralizing in corporate headquarters a process for improving the process of making things at each of those firms, but also an innovation process for coming up with new ideas for cabinets or faucets or whatever, and sharing that across multiple small, essentially what used to be multiple small firms, but becoming an organization that can support both R&D and process improvement.
Sure.
I think it's important to also look at the broader definition of innovation. Innovation could be on a product, it could be on a process, or it could be on an organizational structure. So some of the companies that you think of and what's new and unique about them, how are they different? Oftentimes it's how they're organized to compete and to address things, whether that be Southwest Airlines, Starbucks. It's an approach that they have and made it difficult for others to copy in that regard. One of the things I did want to point out is that many of us in the manufacturing industry have seen innovation a lot. Productivity continues to increase about 2 to 3% a year. That doesn't happen without someone taking time and effort to do that. The process of a continuous process improvement is really in the DNA of many manufacturers. If not, they soon find themselves non-competitive. So we see that part of innovation, the incremental and the process improvements. What we see less of in innovation is the breakthroughs. And breakthroughs innovation, one that combines maybe process and product or structure, is one that has more far-reaching opportunities for revenue, and it's also a much rarer thing to have. It requires a champion. It requires a process, a structured process itself, and it requires recognition that we talked about before, celebration of those items. And unfortunately, many of these items are in short supply, as you pointed out, Chris, in the middle market companies, as they do not have staffing to specifically address these activities.
Yeah, it seems most people are wearing 2, 3, or 4 hats in a middle market company.
Yeah, and again, it's very common. I've got to get product out the door. So again, going back to Kellogg's, a company in a very mature, not fast-growing industry, they have to get better year on year with their production of cereal and breakfast bars and so on. But as an example, when they started coming out with the granola and the breakfast bars and the snack bars 15, 20 years ago, that was a major process change. If that was something that Chris was in charge of manufacturing the process for cereal, you can tell him to do innovation, but at the end of the day, you're going to make sure that you get all your cereal out for the day. This new process of putting bars together is fundamentally different. Mm-hmm. So you somehow have to come up with a way to either take some of the responsibility off Chris for day-to-day operations, or have somebody else in charge of that other process.
And that's the challenge.
On this next slide here, we're going to be talking about how growth brings challenges. But one of the things before we get into that, I want to share with you some of the findings we had in 2012 study, where we were able to segregate the participants into 4 distinct groups. One was the harvester, someone who did not have significant revenues in the last 3 years from new product. They were harvesting or managing the product that's been there for a while. And their whole idea is throughput and being as efficient as possible. We had the accidental, as we mentioned before, the accidental innovator who came up with a great idea and capitalized on it and has taken to market. Very entrepreneurially driven. Those are things that we love to see. They make great conversations. That's about 30% of the population. I failed to mention that the harvesters were about 20%. So 50% of the population did not have a process in place for innovation. The other 50% did, and we consider them to be deliberate innovators. And but we segregated them between 2 categories. We had the deliberate innovators that had the process and maybe had a budget in place and metrics, but the super innovators, which had the process, the budget, and the linkage to the strategy, and a very strong linkage to strategy. So every new project that came on had to be driven by, is it fulfilling our strategy? Is it driving our strategy? If the answer was yes, it got funded and got recognized. And those are the ones that had roughly 100% more breakthrough revenues than the accidental innovators. So it was a huge difference between the super innovator, those that had the strategy linkage, and the accidental.
It's very interesting to hear you talk about the 4 categories, because they make intuitive sense and they can be identified, and you can talk about strategies for improving in each of them. What the current slide's showing is research from my colleague Arvind Chandrasekaran on antecedents to ambidexterity competency. So how do you get good at both exploration, finding new ideas, exploitation, getting better at your process innovation? And the chart is from a study of 110 projects within 34 different organizations. And one of the fundamental findings was, as firm size increases, organizations struggle with overall performance, which is a balance of how much R&D, how much new products, and what's your profit. And a lot of the firms that end up sinking are the harvesters that you found in your innovation study, the ones who, for the short term, can milk a product. But if you don't replace that product, eventually somebody's going to beat you at your own game.
Yep. So let's move on to our next polling question. Next polling question is, who looks most uncomfortable in a tie, the Ohio State researcher or the manufacturing guy? Oh, no, actually, the next polling question is, what is the biggest challenge that you see in introducing new products, processes, or services? Is it discovering the ideas, developing a prototype, or launching the new product, process, or service? And I'll mention with this, what was really neat in watching on the survey results that came back this year was that there were numerous respondents that talked about how they got all levels of the organization involved in innovation now. They talked about even the new eyes, the fresh ideas, the new innovative spirit coming from the newest members of the team, whether it was college graduates coming into the organization or someone coming in from from another company, but it was kind of a no ranks approach to innovation that we saw. So let's take a look at how we're doing here. We'll give it just another second.
I would like to add to that example, and it's consistent with the study we had in 2012, and so there is going to be consistency in the studies because
you hope so.
There's some from year to year, it magnifies some of the findings that we do have. But one of them is the ones that energized the company the most were the cross-functional teams, where different teams came together that supplied a new solution, an innovative way of addressing a problem or a constraint that the company has. And it got them motivated. It got an organization motivated. So it isn't just a department, it isn't just the tooling department, it isn't just the engineering department. It was everybody coming together to figure out what needed to be done.
You're absolutely on target there, Jeff. It's more than just being cross-functional. It's finding a way to tap ideas from many places in your organization and to winnow through what might be hundreds of ideas and find the few keepers, and then finding a process to move those forward.
Okay. So the results are in, and actually developing the prototype seems to be the least of the challenging tasks, which probably isn't surprising. And then launching, or the execution, always seems to be the biggest challenge. Any surprises there?
Not from my standpoint. I look at the commercialization process is once you have a good idea, and I look at it as you come up with the idea, you explore the idea, how it could be used, and then how do we market it? How do we get it out there? How do we get acceptance in the market? Is one where we have a hard time as, speaking from a lot of my clients in the manufacturing organization, they're not set up to do that. But that is where the truth be known, that is where the vote is taken on your innovation. So it's critical that you take it out there and address it. And it's also, all the work that we've done up to that point, it's not surprising that we haven't thought of everything. And the market's going to tell us some things that we didn't think about, and we have to address and consider for market acceptance.
And I think actually that's a very good point you make, that in launching the product, you have to make a plan, you have to sort of beta test that plan, but you have to be ready for surprises. 10 years ago I studied internet ordering for home delivery of groceries, and there's a company in London called Ocado that built a $250 million purpose-built facility and had this grand plan for building out 1/3 of it when they were small, and they were going to have 2/3 unused, and then building out the second third, and then the third. And what I thought was really amazing is that the man who was planning all this, and he said, and if it all works according to plan, then we fall down laughing at ourselves that we actually got it right. And of course, they didn't get it all right, but they adapted over the years and figured out things.
Yep. All right, so let's cut to the chase now and get to the real question. When is it time to separate R&D? Gentlemen?
That's one of the questions we set out to study in our study of middle market firms. So we interviewed a company called TechCom. We used archives and data to get at that. The things we found and the things that we were looking for is when an ownership change happens, when you go from private family-owned firm to a large stock-owned firm, some sort of stagnating sales or revenues is a thing that often forces the changes. Competitive pressures. A competitor comes out with something. Unfortunately, most companies are reactive to this rather than being proactive.
Yeah, so it's really hard for a manufacturing company to, who's never been in this position before to understand when that inflection point occurs. So that inflection point, which identifies a need for change, the call for change, is fought oftentimes to say, no, we can overcome this, versus we need to adapt to this. And that's where the need to have a strategic retreat to really address, are we organized to compete in where we are right now with what our customers want, with what the product is offering, and what the economic trends are going. So it's something that I think companies need to reflect on, to address, and that reflection has to come every so many years. And then rarely is breakthrough innovation claimed by an accidental innovator. It's one of the other things I want to point out. What we see these accidental innovators, are they the ones to adapt? And unfortunately, the answer is they often aren't. Less than 3% of the accidental innovators actually come up with breakthroughs. So if you want to have the process to say, I want to compete, I want to get to this larger size, I want to have these activities, again, you need to be deliberate. And then 30% of our population we had were the superstars. They were very disciplined. They had strong strategic focus, as I mentioned before. They embraced structure, budget, metrics is a big item to identify what it is that they're looking to achieve with regards to the product. How does this correlate with the activity of when is it time to separate? It's when you don't know what you need to have, you need to look at and address what the structure needs to be to support the new innovation, the new drives, the new activities that you're looking to have. And I look to the superstars of what they've done. And it is to have the metrics. So start with a strategy, and you got to have the metrics to support that strategy so you can know when to hold them and when to fold them. So not every innovation is going to be successful.
And that's exactly right. The superstar innovators that you refer to are typically ones that have been a little bit more proactive. They recognize that early on in the company life cycle, they're stagnating, they're kind of doing the same thing day after day. It's comfortable, but there has to be a little bit of pressure to change. And if you're one of those accidental innovators, you're going to end up folding them eventually because you haven't come up with the new ideas. You've got to throw a lot of ideas out there because they're not all going to work equally well.
Yeah. So Ken, take us through our case study here, if you would.
Okay. We studied a small manufacturing firm in a Midwestern city, roughly 70 employees, $100 million in sales. This company we label as TechCom. Because of a non-disclosure agreement, we can't give its name. But they started in the 1950s as a family-owned business, and they evolved over the years. In 1990, they were bought by a private equity firm. There was a cultural change that occurred over 5 to 6 years. And in 2012, they were sold to a Japanese firm at a very nice, healthy profit.
And I assume each of these transactions changed the culture, changed the company, changed the focus in some ways.
Absolutely. It was sort of the DNA in the company still was there, but it was an infusion of new ways of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It seems to me this has to be a fairly successful company with 100 million in sales with 70 employees.
Yes, over the course of 50 years, they've been profitable every year. They've managed to grow their sales without growing employees disproportionately. So what this slide is showing is a very quick overview of what we looked at in the study. We looked at, the company has 3 primary products. So Tech A is their original equipment, was designed for detecting the speed and position of mechanical arms and heavy equipment machines. This technology has stayed stable over a fairly long period of time, so they've continued to make the product in-house and do any changes to the product in-house. Tech B1 was a new opportunity they recognized in the early 1990s to produce drive motors for heavy industrial equipment. It was initially developed and built internally, but they had a hard time keeping up with the innovation. So they eventually decided to outsource manufacturing and retain control of developing new changes to the product, but have somebody else manufacture it. And finally, Tech B2 is AC drives rather than direct current. The company chose to do both R&D and manufacturing externally because while they recognized and understood the market, they didn't feel they had the skills in this different technology. So they chose to outsource, and they've been successful with both those efforts. The director of product B2 was quoted, we interviewed them for an hour and a half, and he said the AC drive market certainly is much more of a commodity market, and you have to have economies of scale to allow us to compete there, whereas the DC market's less of a commodity market for sure. For us to enter a market like that today, it's just a huge barrier of entry. So this firm very strategically chose to keep some parts of its manufacturing R&D in-house and outsource some other parts. But they didn't come to that overnight. They came through it through ownership changes, these cultural changes that we talked about earlier. They had a couple years where they struggled financially. That was really a big motivator for them to make some of these changes.
So the changes got made, decisions got made. It was, listening to you, wasn't necessarily proactively looking at the crystal ball and saying, oh, we're going to have to do this. It was going through some pains, which really made them get to these realizations.
It was going through some pains, but I would contrast them with a lot of companies that are even slower to recognize the changes.
Sure.
So while to some degree it was a little bit reactive, they were fairly quick in recognizing the signals that they needed to make some changes.
Mm-hmm. So obviously this is a complex question that we're dealing with, and there's not a one-size-fits-all, but it seems like we've all agreed that for R&D and for innovation, better accountability and better processes really are a trait of the most successful innovators. I mean, Jeff, that's what your study, 2012, really showed, isn't it?
That is correct. It's being deliberate about innovation versus accidental about innovation, and all the components of being deliberate. Budgeting, planning, resources, allocation, were part of that decision.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we talked earlier about the rewards as well, and it reminds me of a situation I had with the board of directors I was meeting with a few months ago, where they were working on killing an innovation project. They had tried it, it just wasn't feasible, and so they were killing that project. And the discussion really was how this expense to the bottom line was going to impact management bonuses. And I pointed out to them, well, you know, you're a third generation company who hasn't really innovated much in the last 10 years. Are you sure this is sending the right message? And it was kind of an aha moment to them that, oh my gosh, yes, we have these mechanics of our bonus structure, but this is not the situation to exercise those mechanics. So it really is a lot of facets coming together.
And when it comes to the rewards and, if you will, the punishment, we got to look at this as a learning experience. And did we learn from it? And shame on us if we don't have the process in place to identify when to fold. So if we don't have the metrics going in or what we expect, it's really hard to identify what that time period is when we say, stop. We got to stop spending and let's move on to the next project. What do we learn from this so we can take it and not repeat ourselves in that process again, but what can we learn from that and go forward? So there is a fine line, and to me it's all about that structure, having that structure up front.
Mm-hmm. And it's very important to evaluate the process of R&D more so than the outcome of the process, because as an example, if you get 100 people in a room and ask them all to flip a coin, one time it might come up 30%, one time it comes up 50%, and one time it comes up 70%. And this relates to R&D, is when it's 70%, everybody's going to take credit. When it's 30%, there's a saying that failure is an orphan that nobody wants to claim. That happens with R&D and innovation, but it doesn't mean that your organization failed. It means that the idea wasn't as successful. So what you need to do is try to look at metrics for what the process is and what you can learn from what happened with that innovation and how you can improve on it the next time.
Sure. And I was just in a discussion earlier this week with one of your colleagues where they were talking about failed ideas may just be failed timing, and so having kind of a parking lot of ideas isn't a bad thing.
Sure. Apple came out with the Newton in 1995, which was essentially the iPad 10 to 15 years later. It wasn't as developed, but they came back with a new idea, and look what it's done now.
Yep.
One of the things I want to point out is we look at these options, in the options that you have to choose from. I'd like to point out that it's not all or nothing. You know, this goes without saying. You could collaborate, not collaborate. You could do this, do that. It's a strategic decision, number one. What do you feel most comfortable with, and what are you willing to invest in? But I think there's an ecosystem of ideas or of innovators out there that you can plug into, whether it be a research institution such as Ohio State University, or if it's a trade association, or a customer. And we look at we talked about the automotive before in the tier structure, where the cars have become so much more innovative. A lot of those innovations didn't start at General Motors or Ford or Toyota. They started at the supplier and were spawned there, and then it came in and were adopted by the original equipment manufacturers.
Sure. Let's go to our next polling question. Which of the following statements apply to you? And you can check as many as do apply. My firm has metrics to measure innovation. My firm budgets for innovation. My firm has financial and or non-financial rewards for innovation. So please respond to as many apply to you. So let's talk about metrics for a minute. Does it matter what the metrics are, or is it just having metrics?
It does eventually does matter. Not having metrics is probably the worst sin of all, because as this old saying goes, any road taken when there's not a plan is a good road. So we want to have the right road. We want to be able to identify not just directionally where we want to go. We want the timing of when we want to have it done, and so much of this is the timing. It's the budget you might have available for it. It might be the resources, the capability of the team to address it, the capability of the organization to accept the changes that the team comes up with may need to be addressed. So frankly, I think it's looking at your inputs, it's looking at your outputs, it is going to be looking at your capabilities and your leadership component associated with that. One of the things I did want to point out is when we looked at our superstar innovators, they canceled more projects as a percentage of projects than anybody else. So what does that say to me? Well, first of all, it said they had more projects. But they also had a process in place to identify when to cancel it and when to move on to the next project. So it was a process. It wasn't just a skunk works. It was a process they had in place with the metrics to support it.
So they weren't afraid to start them, but they also weren't afraid to stop them.
Right, and I think it's important to realize that a couple things. One is you need both individual metrics and group metrics for the team working on the project. And when you're talking about budgets for innovation, it's not just financial budgets, it's budgeting human capital. And you can work on a project initially with a fairly small team, but as it becomes bigger and you start to roll it out, the team gets much larger. And that's the point at which you ought to take a hard look at the project and say, okay, some of these we ought to walk away from, otherwise you'll get overextended.
Mm-hmm. And so from the results here, it does look like metrics are the harder to implement, and fewer of these companies have metrics in place. But there is quite a few, 63% of the respondents that do have budgets for innovation already. That's fantastic.
It is fantastic, and really that's quite heartening to see, that type of proactive approach to creating the process.
And I think one of the things that research has consistently shown is that innovation ought to be looked at once a company gets to a certain size as sort of strategic bundles. So think of putting things in buckets so that you're not putting all your eggs in one basket if possible. So not only have a budget, but try to spread that budget across multiple projects. Mm-hmm. And then, as Jeff says, kill the projects that aren't looking real successful at a certain point.
Okay, so let's talk about critical success factors then.
So here's 3 items in here, and I think you can put it down into 3 categories: how much, how effective, and leadership. And so the how much and how effective, the how much is actually easy to measure. The how effective gets a little bit fuzzier to measure, and the leadership is downright impossible to measure, but you got to try doing something. It's a period of self-reflection. So, the approach to implementation is involving this planning, monitoring, and learning, and addressing it from that standpoint. Innovation is there should be accountability. The leaders should be accountable for the results, but they shouldn't also be punished for the results. It requires time for them to there should be mixed accountabilities, results, actions, and learning.
And I think one of the things is that can be helpful is having teams. Earlier when we talked about separating R&D and manufacturing, they should be kept separate, but somebody at the top needs to be keeping track of the level of the work and comparing the results. So you want a degree of knowledge sharing between different project teams or people working on different ideas. You also want a degree of competition. Competition's good. If Chris has a team doing one innovation project and Jeff has a team doing another innovation project, you both want to be successful, but we need some sort of structure to make a decision at the end of the day. Do we go with both of the projects and fund them both highly, or do we pick Chris's or Jeff's and roll forward with that?
You know, it's interesting, going back to my comment earlier about the racing teams and how they can be an R&D arm to the OEMs. I was mentioning that to a friend of mine who's an engineer at one of the OEMs, and he was very quick to remind me that, well, we sent innovation their way as well. And it was, you talk about that competition, and they do. They compete against each other and within the same team. So it's a healthy competition, but it's competition.
Yeah, and McDonald's has always characterized itself as a three-legged stool. So they're owner-operators, they're suppliers, and they're corporate headquarters. And ideas for innovation can come from all three. So they have examples of ideas coming from their suppliers. Simplo Potatoes came up with the way of flash freezing French fries in the 1960s. They failed once, spent their own money to build a factory. They came back and did it another time, and they eventually became a $500 million supplier of French fries to McDonald's. Their owner-operators come up with ideas like the Egg McMuffin, and the person who came up with that invented the circle for making the egg circular. And corporate is there to also come up with larger scale innovations and to systematize things. So innovation can happen in a variety of ways with different partners.
Yeah, one of the ways innovation can happen, in case you're interested, is we have a webinar coming up, Buying Innovation as an Option. So we didn't talk too much about buying innovation here today. That wasn't our purpose. But if you are interested in that as a topic, I would encourage you on Thursday, December 12th to tune in to that webinar as well. We'll have Brian Langham from Plant Moran, as well as Pedro Guillen from the World Industrial Reporter, and Michael Camp, founder of the Tech Institute at Ohio State as well. So that'll be a great webinar if you're interested. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions you might have. And let's start with, let me get to a screen here where I can see it. In each development cycle, our biggest challenges concerning getting to market soon with a scaled-down product versus delaying a release until all the bells and whistles are ready. How do you make these decisions? That's a tough one.
That's a tough one. You have to partly be scanning the environment, feeling what's out there. You have to also kind of look at how easy is it to upgrade a product once you introduce it. There are a lot of things that are kind of all or nothing. If I put the process in place now, I can't change it. But it's very common for people to introduce a product with 80% of the features and then come out and improve it. So there's a flexibility in the process that's important there too.
I think it's important on the product, as Boeing will attest to at this point in time, that certain products there's no room for error. It's got to be nailed down and it's got to be perfect, and it really helps the sentiment and the acceptance of the public.
There's a question, who should be responsible for the resource allocation within an organization? Any opinions on that?
It tends to differ, and there's research out there that says that for less complex products, they can be made at the top level and coordinated by the top level, but as the product becomes more complex, there's more of an incentive to push much of the decision making down to the project manager. Not unsupervised, but down where the levels of expertise are. So put it in a project management team that's very familiar with that product or the area that they're developing in. So you kind of have to look at the complexity. Another thing that's important to look at is what are the penalties for failure and success. It needs to be a combination of top down and bottom up, and the organization has to really think about when is it appropriate to do either approach.
I'd like to also add it deals with the strength of the linkage to the strategy. if the linkage is very strong, there's a high motivation to fund it, and that really comes from the leaders. So that's from the upper level.
Okay. So how about, this one will challenge you a little. So R&D, separating R&D, does that help you at all from a tax perspective, speaking of R&D credits, or completely separate?
So the R&D credits is an interesting one. So it certainly will help you clarify and identify some projects that need to be included in the R&D credits that you can get. And there is credits that you can have that the federal government allows. They're pretty complex how you get there. But the credits that you can have in the research and development for the tax purposes can be found throughout the organization. They're not going to be found in one department. They're going to be found throughout the organization, including process improvements that you have. As we say, that there's a lot of process improvements, continuous process improvements done in the manufacturing as part of their DNA. That needs to be captured as well. So it's a good start. It won't be the end.
And it's an important thing to look for, particularly right now when the government's shut down. If you can get ahead of the government, it's a good thing.
Well, we'd like to remind you that these slides that we've used today, as well as the Plant Moran R&D or Plant Moran Innovation Study and Ken Boyer's research paper are all available for download using the resource widget. And with that, Ken, Jeff, I'd like to thank you for your expertise and your time today. And to the audience, we'd like to thank you for your participation. Have a great day.